Well, hello and welcome everybody to the Resilient Leadership Podcast, where everything we talk about is aimed at helping you to lead with a greater sense of calm, clarity, and conviction, even in anxious times. My name is Bridget Tyre, and as always, I am joined today by my wonderful co-host, Irvine Nugent. Irvine, how the heck are you today?
Oh, I'm doing great, Bridget. Thanks for asking. Yeah, summer is upon us, and I love summer, so getting in the mood. Today's episode, we're continuing. The last episode was a first for the Resilient Leadership Podcast in that we had a first-time guest, Kathleen Smith, who was amazing. And so Kathleen has come back because there's just so much information in her book to talk about. So we're going to finish up that conversation. If you haven't listened to that episode, Kathleen is the author of two books. The first was called Everything Isn't Terrible. And the second one, which is just about to be published, is True to You, A Therapist's Guide to Stop Pleasing Others and Start Being Yourself. And of course, Kathleen comes to us with this deep knowledge of Bowen theory, and we've referred to that in many of her episodes, and thinking in systems, and we talked in the last episode about anxiety. So we're going to jump in where we left off before. We're kind of going through this new book and pulling out some great nuggets. So Kathleen, welcome once again to the show.
Thanks for having me back. I'm glad I didn't mess it up the first time.
No, quite the opposite. One of the things I noticed in the book is the way you talk about, three reactions that we have when it comes to escalating anxiety that really steal or drain our energy. And so the three of them are accommodating, avoiding, and acting out. I'd love for you if you could share with our listeners, what do these patterns look like and how might they impact the various relationships that we have in our lives?
Right. So there's so many different ways to categorize the patterns and relationships that we use to kind of manage anxiety. And so I'm constantly challenging myself to describe them in different ways. But the writer Anne Lamott, who's one of my favorite writers, she said something once explain to me like I'm a 5-year-old or a golden retriever. And so I'm always telling myself that in my head, how do you talk about the theory in a way that's like a 5-year-old or a golden retriever is listening? So I like to keep it simple. And one way I've kind of organized them is, what do you do when the tension is up? Do you accommodate? And by accommodate, I mean maybe give in to what the other person wants. Maybe they want you to function for them and tell them what to do. Maybe they want you to be quiet and let them run the show, right? Or maybe they want you to tell them that everything's going to be okay, right? We accommodate and adjust in sort of so many ways day to day that really eats up a lot of energy. Or we might avoid. We might not want to have anything to do with somebody altogether. Maybe we don't have any contact with them, or we don't bring up meaningful conversations we need to have with somebody, and we just stick to kind of superficial talk. There's so many ways that we kind of avoid or distance ourselves. And then the third, acting out. A lot of things fall under acting out, and there's not necessarily a clear separation with these categories. Some of the behaviors could kind of be all three, but I think of acting out as sort of regressing into your own immaturity. Like, I'm going to fight with you and try and change you and convince you why you're wrong. Or I'm going to start acting like a teenager when I go home to visit my family. Or I'm going to gossip about this person to a third person, even though I know it's not helpful and I shouldn't do that, right? We all have ways we kind of act out, especially when others are behaving poorly. That kind of gives us permission to do the same. And so it's just been a helpful way in some of my work with clients to help them just pay attention, let's say on a single day, to notice what are the ways you accommodate, what are the things or conversations you avoid, and then how do you sort of act out in how you behave. And, I'd say most of us do some combination of all three, maybe not every day, but I would say every week probably. And then those are the opportunities for doing something different. How do you be yourself, but stay connected to people without doing these three things? And that's where the fun starts.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that you say that's where the fun starts, because I got the biggest kick. I think I laughed out loud when I was reading this section of the book, and you had examples of each. And one of your examples under accommodating was, do you sometimes take out those exclamation marks when you're doing an email because you don't want to come across as over enthusiastic to somebody who's not that way? And I thought, guilty. And I literally almost went back on my exclamation marks in the email like the next day. And I'm like, wait, maybe I won't do that, you know? So being an observer of this is the way we catch ourselves, right? You know, one of the things you have in the book is you've got some great exercises. I'm wondering if, you know, you might share with our listeners if they want to do less accommodating or avoiding or acting out. Of course, being an observer is a good place to start, but is there an exercise you might recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of making a bingo board. All the things you're trying not to do. That's one way to not be so hard on yourself, right? To kind of, let's say you're about to go into a big meeting or you're about to go home to visit your family, to just be able to ask yourself, what are the things that I might avoid, you know, and then, you know, maybe I try to not get a bingo, right? Or there's all kinds of ways to kind of be playful about it. And I think, you know, leading from that place of observation, I think gives you a better chance to say, well, you know what? I am not going to slam the door when I leave the room after having a disagreement with my mother, or I am going to ask this person what they want to do about this challenge instead of assuming I know what they think, or knowing that I'll disagree with them and I won't like it. You know, you start to create the opportunities to do something different by being on the lookout for the things that you normally do.
Yeah, in a specific situation, right?
Yeah.
Like in this meeting, I might normally do this, or when I go visit my parents, I might normally do that. So how can I not get 3 in a row?
Yeah, totally.
I like that because, you know, we're not being as hard on ourselves. We might do some acting out, but we might not do it 3 times in a row. I love it. One of the patterns that you talk about in the book is conflict, is one of the 4 main patterns that arise in anxious families or teams. I really love the way you defined conflict. And you said it as this: when 2 people are trying to change one another and neither one is giving in. And I thought, wow, that for me really nailed it. What's another option to conflict, especially I think when we really do feel like the other person is wrong, right? Like we really feel convicted that they do need to amend their ways. How can we deal with one another with another option besides just keep trying to change the other person and not giving in?
My first question for folks is what have you been doing and how effective has that been? You know, how effective have your attempts been to get the other person to change, you know? And do you want to try a different thing, you know? That's different than going along with what they want you to do. But being able to ask yourself, who do I want to be when somebody, you know, is attacking me or somebody shows me their immaturity? How do I kind of want to show up? You know, I was listening to an interview the other day that somebody gave, and they were talking about the first time they came across Dr. Murray Bowen, and he was presenting on something related to his theory, and all of these researchers or clinicians in the audience were really arguing with him and telling him how he was wrong. And they were observing how they used the phrase, he didn't throw bricks back, you know, but he was engaging with their ideas. He was able to say, well, you know, I think about it differently. Here's what I think. Here's what I think the science says. You know, so he was defining himself and his thinking to them in a way that wasn't conflictual, because it takes both parties to create the conflict, right? So what does it mean to define yourself to other people without trying to convince them, without the pressure sort of heading in their direction? And that could mean saying, this is what I will do. This is what I believe. This is what I will not put up with. You know, here's what you can expect from me when you behave this way, right? But how taking away that pressure of convincing or correcting, how that gives the front part of another person's brain the chance to consider whether you might be right or whether they were wrong or what they want to do, right? It doesn't mean that they will change, but it does mean that that their thinking is engaged in a way that it is not when they feel the anxiety coming towards them from you. And so, you know, we get so fixated on what we can do to convince or change people. We ignore the fact that change happens when people have the freedom to sort of arrive at their own thinking, right? But that's just hard to do when you're really convinced that something needs to change a certain way for things to get better.
Love that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was just reading a book on conflict dynamics, and the theory behind this one was, when there's so much anxiety and it's ratcheting up and everyone's caught up in it, that very often what can unfold the anxiety is a what they call a conciliatory gesture. And what they mean by that, it's not folding up. It's just like this thoughtfulness about really considering the other point of view, you could just see kind of they weren't using Bowen theory, but you just see kind of that influence there of showing up and bringing down the anxiety, and then this almost a beneficial cycle happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, one of the other lines that really jumped out at me, Kathleen, in the book was about, you say, gaining more self is the pathway to greater maturity. And I stopped and I thought, what an interesting line. And as we kind of work through the various dilemmas we have in our relationships. So I would love for you just to kind of unpack that a little bit. What do you mean by gaining more self on that pathway to maturity? And maybe give us an example of what that might look like in our lives.
Yeah, so I think of self as being sort of the degree to which your acting is consistent with your thinking. Does how you operate reflect your thinking about how you want to operate or what you're trying to do? Let's say as a leader, as a parent, whatever the arena of life is you're talking about. And then asking, where does my thinking come from? Is it coming from something that I have very quickly borrowed, something somebody has told me to do, the beliefs that I sort of inherited from my family or another group, which are not good or bad, but it's just examining sort of the origin story you have from this thinking, and being able to ask yourself, well, what does it look like to add a little bit more self to the equation, to learn more, to let new information and new experiences challenge those previous beliefs. And then sort of the more solid that thinking is, I think the less susceptibility we have towards using other people's reactions as the metric for how well we're doing. Let's say as a leader, or your feelings as a metric, which are also not very reliable, because the feelings will change from moment to moment and day to day, right? Dr. Roberta Gilbert, who's a Bowen theory writer, in one of her books, I can't remember which one, but she says something like, believe in your position enough to be calm for it, and I think about that. That is such a good definition of maturity, right? Like, you've done enough thinking and sort of self-examination that you can kind of stand by it, and how useful that is, whether people agree with it or not, to have somebody in an organization who's working on that and isn't just chasing after or avoiding the anxious reactions of others. So
I really love that. I love that idea of kind of what metric are you using to measure? Is it a metric of other people's reaction? Is it a metric of your own feelings? And are you able to stand firm? We've talked about that in other episodes, and sometimes a leader introduces change or something, and the blowback is people resist it, or people may even sabotage you. And so often we get caught up in their reactions, and really to be able to really, think about that, and to think, no, what I'm standing on is solid, and to do that in a non-reactive way. Love that. Another line that jumped out at me in the book was, questions engage our best thinking in a way that answers cannot. I love that line. Can you speak a little bit more about that and why that is so?
Yeah, and I actually wrote about this for my newsletter recently, how I see part of my job as a therapist or as a Bowen theory coach is to put myself out of business, and that's when I can really see the progress is with people, is when they're coming with the questions and they can generate good questions for themselves day to day or week to week. It's great to have mantras and wisdom that you want to hold on to. I think that's a very important piece of life and leadership. But I think it's useful to have guiding questions you want to wake up with every day, or every week, to say, I don't know. An example could be just like, how do I want to be responsible for myself today? What thinking do I want to put into action? I mean, or even as simple as, what am I trying to do here? We often haven't asked ourselves that question,
What do I want?
Yeah. Right? How would I define success. What would be the evidence that I was functioning up a little or was doing a better job? What do I see as the evidence that's within my control, right? I mean, those are just good questions. And that's really kind of kickstarts the front part of the brain in a way that just having 5 rules you live by does not. Yeah, so I see part of my job is because when people get very focused on my questions, which I hope can be helpful, then it's easy to get fixated on the other, borrowing from the other person, right? And them having the solutions for you. That anxious seeking of answers really shuts down the level of curiosity, and I think if people can wrap their mind around the fact that getting curious is, let's say, 90% of the battle, because it's turning on the part of the brain that sets goals, solves problems, regulates you enough to not do sort of what's tempting or automatic, right? Then there you go. That's all you need, right? And so you can have a lot of really good advice and answers, but if that's coming from, let's say, the back of the brain where we're just sort of anxiously borrowing and doing whatever we need to calm down, then there's how much of you gets lost in that process, and how much do you end up putting energy towards things that you actually don't care about or don't agree with? Yeah. So I love questions, and I love asking people, what are the questions that have been helpful for you? What's one question you want to hold on to or start the day with? And people do not like that often. They look at me like, I'm paying you to ask the questions, Kathleen. I'm supposed to come up with it. Like, what are you doing here? Right. And so I think it's hard for people to wrap their minds around that, because we are such, as we said, I think in the previous episode, we're such an answer focused society.
Yeah. Quick fix. As I was listening to your questions, the kinds of questions you were suggesting or putting out there are what you call growing questions in your book, as opposed to anxious questions. So you gave lots of good examples of growing questions. What are some examples of anxious questions, and why is that distinction so important?
Anxious questions normally aren't rooted in reality. Questions like, am I doing enough? Like, I ask this sometimes as a parent, am I doing enough for my child? Like, who the heck knows? I don't. Society will probably say no, because they have lots of definitions of that, right? They're very vague, and they tend to lead towards that anxious borrowing of answers. And I think also anxious questions are like, what does this person think of me? Are they happy with me? Am I living up to these expectations? I can't remember the examples I gave in the book. Yeah, I mean, they're very focused on other people and other people's reactions. That's a recipe for more anxiety, I think.
Well, yeah, that's the litmus test, is they make us more anxious, right? The questions themselves. Yeah, I think that's so important. I love the fact that you're really challenging your clients to not only be curious and to listen to your questions, but to come up with their own questions. Right? That's wonderful, because that's a muscle that, that you help them build. There's a part in your book, and I think it's in part 2. In fact, maybe this is the first chapter in that second part of the book. And the chapter is titled Ending the Chase for Approval and Attention. That caught my eye, because Irvine, you and I did a whole episode about how it's so important for leaders to not get caught up in the desire to be popular and well-liked, that if you do, you will fail to make those difficult decisions that you have to do. But what I think was so interesting in this chapter is that you talk about why we do seek approval and attention, and that it's normal, and that it's the way our brains work. Literally, they work this way. Can you share a little bit more about that? Because I thought the brain science behind this chase for approval and attention was fascinating.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a Vegas casino. Like, if we got it all the time, it wouldn't be as thrilling, right? So like, you're gonna, let's say, win the slot machine part of the time, but not others. So the times you get the reward, that dopamine spike is much higher. Let's say, like, your family members, your really close friends, right? If they say nice things about you, that's great, right? But it's not this, they're always going to do that, or most of the time, right? Depending on the relationship. But like the time you get praise from like somebody, let's say, who's quote, really important, or let's say a colleague you really respect, or a teacher or somebody, right? That's really good because we can't always depend on it. And so we invest a lot of energy sort of chasing after this sort of spike of dopamine because it provides this functional boost. This is a thing for Bowen theory. So there's this idea that you really can't tell how mature a person is because most of us are propped up most of the time by other factors like caffeine. I got an A on this test. I got a raise at work. Like somebody complimented my outfit. My sports team, is doing well in the playoffs. There are a million variables that kind of give us this little boost, which, that makes sense. But how much energy do we spend chasing after them? And what do we not get done when we're sacrificing energy in that way? And so it's really, I wrote about this in my newsletter once. I called it the little boosts that keep us from ourselves. What are the sort of the shiny things we chase after that really maybe aren't as important to us, or not what brought us, let's say, to the field in the first place, with our work or our interests, that at a low moment, we really go after. I think it's good to pay attention to those things.
Mm. And I think, again, that helps us knowing the way our brains work. It helps us to be compassionate with ourselves, that of course, this is what we do. It's how we're wired. And, if we are so busy chasing those sort of episodic, boosts of attention or approval, it's less energy we have to think about and define for ourselves about our own approval. Do I approve or not approve, of what I'm doing? So I found that so, so helpful. I love it.
Yeah, I love that. I'm just reflecting on my own life, because kind of this would be a tendency definitely that I have. But I love what you say, when it comes unexpectedly, when you've given up the hunt for it and something comes your way, kind of, whoa, the boost. I remember like my eldest sister, I'm the youngest and the only boy. So I gave up years ago looking for compliments, because they weren't coming. And I remember we were at a meeting a few years ago and she said to me, for a spoiled little brat, you really turned out well. And I was like, wow, that's like the best compliment, and it was kind of like so chuffed, and it wasn't, it was kind of a half compliment, but it was, and I thought I'd given up on that. There you go. But it is this, this ever seeking. And I think another tendency you talk about, moving on for this chase for approval and attention is this comparison with others in the group, which, boy, that comes up so often, with leaders when we talk to them. And you have a wonderful phrase in the book about this. And you say, we can learn to balance that because, again, it's there. But how do you balance that? And you say you can balance it by looking for opportunities to put down the ruler and pick up the compass. So I'd love you to speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think first of all, just recognizing how innate that tendency is. I spoke about this previously. We're animals that are also hierarchical creatures, like most mammals are. Elephants know where they rank in the group, who gets to drink from the watering hole first and who has to wait their turn. And we're not that much different. It is a survival mechanism. It's useful to know sort of how you shape up and how you compare to others. The stakes aren't the same, and it's okay to bring some of your own individuality or to have a different measure for yourself. And so that's why I use the metaphor of the compass. So sort of what direction do you want to go in? When do you find yourself chasing after things or putting energy towards things that actually aren't that important or interesting to you? You're just doing it because other people are doing it, and you're anxiously borrowing their definition of what success looks like, let's say professionally. It's so easy to kind of get caught up in that. It's useful to a degree to pay attention to what other people are doing, but again, there's not too much self in that, and there are a lot of variables outside of your control. So being able to kind of sit down and ask yourself, how do I want to evaluate myself? What does good work look like today? I always encourage people to scale it down to smaller units of time. How do I want to show up today? Where do I want to put my energy? If I'm not careful, where will my energy go? you know, and just being able to kind of have to work that muscle of self-evaluation that we don't really, unless often like an employer forces you to, you don't really practice that muscle, being able to sit down and not be too hard on yourself, but not be too positive either. To say, what do I think I've done well? What is still a challenge for me? That takes a lot of the emotion out of it. And I think that is it's just such a relief to be able to do that for yourself.
Oh, it sure is. I'm thinking about my own experience and some of the people that I coach. I think that comparison game is especially strong when we're kind of new in a role and we don't feel as secure yet, right? So we're looking at, well, how do other leaders do this? How do they run their meetings? Or I remember when I first became a coach, Irvine, I don't know if you had this going on too, but when I was brand new to coaching, I hadn't defined myself yet as a coach. I hadn't done a lot of coaching yet. And I remember, really comparing myself pretty harshly to other coaches. Oh, I'm never going to be as good as that coach or that, And you're right. It's such a relief when we can, acknowledge that that's what humans do. We make comparisons, but that we can also do something else, which is that we can, as you said, put down the ruler and pick up the compass. And just think a little bit, how would I define success for me as a new coach? What does that look like, right? Yeah, such a wonderful thing. Well, Kathleen, this conversation has been terrific. And quite frankly, I could go on and have it all day, but I think you actually have a hard stop.
I do. I don't want to leave my daughter waiting for me at school. So got to go pick her up.
Yeah, you define being a good mother as picking up your daughter on time. So
that's a pretty good standard.
Yeah.
We're going to let you do that. But thank you so much. And I would remind our listeners once again that Kathleen's new book, True to You, will be available for purchase July 9th. Did I get that right, Kathleen?
Yep.
Yeah. And Irvine and I can attest, I'll speak for myself. I can attest that it is a terrific book worth purchasing with so many nuggets of wisdom in it. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your talent with us today.
Thank you, guys. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And Kathleen, just our listeners may be curious, how can they learn a little bit more about you? And I know the last episode you mentioned that you have a newsletter. So why don't you mention that again in case they didn't catch that episode and they're just listening for the first time?
Yeah. So my newsletter is called The Anxious Overachiever and it's on Substack. If you literally just go to Google and type in Kathleen Smith newsletter, you'll be able to find it. My website is also Kathleen Smith Writes, WRITES.com.
Awesome. Well, Kathleen, thank you so much. You have been a source of great wisdom and lots of nuggets to chew upon. And we hope listeners have enjoyed this. And we look forward to welcome you in our next episode. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.